A lot of times you read a book or you watch a TV show, particularly you watch a TV show, I guess, for this example to make sense, and the show happens to go somewhere that you know. And you'll watch it and you'll be like, oh, exciting, that's my town. And then they actually show an establishing shot of your town and you go, what the heck is that? That's not it at all. It doesn't even look like it. Obviously, Vancouver, Washington for a long time was the stand-in for every town everywhere. The desert outside of L.A. is the stand-in for every desert or scrubland or mountain scene anywhere because it's close and you can shoot there. I remember one time I was watching an old show. It's called Jericho, and I think they went to Cheyenne, Wyoming. And I'm like, Cheyenne? They're going to where I'm from. I'm from Wyoming and northern Colorado. This is going to be great. And then the establishing shot of Cheyenne is this CGI nightmare of something that looks kind of like how a child with Microsoft Paint would imagine Estes Park, Colorado to be in the high mountains. It just wasn't even close. It was awful. And here's the thing. It doesn't matter. It didn't affect the show at all. If nobody's been to Cheyenne, it doesn't matter. Cheyenne was just far away from Jericho, Kansas. Good enough, right? Because a lot of times in storytelling, there's nothing about these various places that we go around to that is really important to the story because the story is just entirely fiction. And really, we just need to go somewhere that's like, it's in the West. There, now we're there. Okay, now we got to go to a location that is somewhere in the American South. Great. That looks good enough to stand in for. You just go with it. And as the viewer, you accept that because the plot is not dependent, in the case of that old show Jericho, on any of the details of the geography or the institutions or the buildings in Cheyenne, Wyoming being a certain way. Just whatever, it works. But in this story, it's held out as though the details of Susa really matter. The timeline really matters. Who was in charge of things really matters. And so here at the end of chapter 2, I don't think we're just getting some magical fairyland throwaway story about, and there was an attempt on the king's life somewhere once upon a time. The details are so robust and in keeping with what we know from extra biblical history that it looks like what's being described at the end of Esther chapter 2 is an assassination attempt on the king of lands, the king of kings, Xerxes the First, that everybody would have known about, including knowing the names of the conspirators. This is written as though the author of Esther is trying to help the reader connect the dots and draw on pre-existing knowledge of this king and the Xerxesian era to help orient themselves with where things are in this more discrete story, this more behind-the-scenes story that is being told about Esther. So bear that in mind and check out this story here that ends with a hanging. Esther 2:21. During the time Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate, like we talked about yesterday, an actual gate you can still go to. Everybody could have pictured it. It's not like a gate that could be on a town somewhere. This is the king's gate. It's on that wall, on that side of that palace in that city of Susa, and it was at its most beautiful and prominent during the era of Darius and Xerxes. Again, we have extra biblical inscriptions to support that. So during that time at that gate, these two guys, Bigthana and Teresh, two of the king's officers who guarded the doorway, became angry and conspired to assassinate King Xerxes. The author of Esther has given us those two names to differentiate this plot against the king that resulted in public executions from other plots against the king that also resulted in public executions. People around Susa and the seats of power of Persia would have remembered this. But also these kinds of examples usually got advertised, especially given the way we know Xerxes does business. I mean, he advertised that his wife disrespected him at a drunken party one time. He's going to advertise this as well at the behest of the same 7 influencers and council members who had him advertise what Vashti did to disrespect him. So word is going to spread that these two guys are disgraced for having plotted against the king, that plots against the king don't work. You will get found out, you will be hung, and your family will pay the consequences. This is how a king in this era would avoid anybody trying to duplicate that. So the specifics that we're getting here from the author of Esther are designed to really precisely orient us in time. And what the reader is supposed to do is to be like, well, wait a minute. Did Mordecai and Esther have something to do with that plot or having it foiled? And the answer, my dear reader friend, is yep. Verse 22. But Mordecai found out about the plot and told Queen Esther, who in turn reported it to the king, giving credit to Mordecai. So that's how these dirtbags who were going to kill the King of Kings got found out. And already we are seeing that the providential positioning of Esther, though it has not yet been good for the Jews, it has been good for Xerxes. Xerxes thought he was just picking the prettiest girl to be his new wife, but what he didn't realize is that with Esther, the bonus was he also got an agent whose eyes and ears would be faithful and loyal to him, both out of loyalty to the king, but also out of loyalty to his ward, his charge, his adoptive kid, Esther. And Mordecai is a man of virtue, and so he won't allow this plot to stand, and in doing so, he ingratiates himself to the king. Verse 23, and when the report was investigated and found to be true, the two officials were hanged on a gallows. All this was recorded in the book of the annals in the presence of the king. Okay, we're going to talk about the ingratiation that I just promised in a second, but first let's talk about the hanging. This seems to have been a popular way with Darius and Xerxes of killing people who needed killed, because you'll recall that after Darius found the proclamation of Cyrus that said, indeed, you guys can go and rebuild your temple, Darius expanded that proclamation that was found in the archives of Ecbatana, another one of the capitals of the Persians, the old capital of the Medes. And in Ezra, I think, chapter 4, I brought a Bible with me. I'm just going to turn on there and make sure it was Ezra chapter 4. No, I'm an idiot. This is why I don't have friends and nobody loves me. It's Ezra chapter 6. At the end of Ezra chapter 6, Darius adds to the decree of Cyrus, saying, furthermore, I decree that if anyone changes this edict, a beam is to be pulled from his house, and he is to be lifted up and impaled on it. And for this crime, his house is to be made a pile of rubble. May God, who has caused his name to dwell there, overthrow any king or people who lifts a hand to change the decree or to destroy this temple in Jerusalem. Is that really about his love for Jerusalem and the God of the Jews? No. It's about his love for continuity from Cyrus and stabilizing his reign and his authority. So it seems like this public hanging or public impaling, it might be the same execution technique being described here with just different words that are slightly difficult to translate. Either way, it looks like the preferred method of execution was this public impaling or hanging, maybe even with the beam of these people's own building, to symbolize you are impaled upon this visual symbol of the stability of your family name and your house. This is the ultimate punishment, the ultimate example making that happens here for these guys. So on the one hand, we read that and we're like, hooray, that's good. The bad guys got it, and Mordecai ingratiates himself. But at the same time, we're also reminded every time things look good, there's something dangerous lurking right around the corner. So we want to keep an eye out for banquets moving forward that are chased with intrigue, resulting in people getting impaled on beams and gallows of their own making. And it might seem a little bit much, like maybe Xerxes is a little bit paranoid here. Maybe these guys were just shooting the breeze. But the truth is, Xerxes definitely had reason to be concerned about assassination plots. In fact, it's an assassination plot that ends the reign of King Xerxes. In August of 465, Artabanus, not the Artabanus who was the uncle of Xerxes, who, remember in that passage we read from Herodotus, counseled Darius against going to war against the Scythians, and then counseled his son Xerxes against going to war against the Greeks. But then remember, Xerxes had a dream, and in the dream, he was told by some kind of Zoroastrian angel to go and change some things about what he was doing. And then he's like, what the heck? And in a story that kind of echoes Gideon and putting out a fleece from the Bible, Xerxes has Artabanus dress up like him and sit there and see if he has the same vision, and he does. And they're like, we're friends now. We're going to invade Greece together. God wills it. And then maybe not. Kind of a funny outcome when you think of it that way. But then this Artabanus is a different guy, a younger guy, the one who ultimately kills Xerxes. He does this deed 20 years after that war council where Artabanus dressed up like Xerxes. Is a different guy, And his deal was that he got tangled up in the eunuch culture, the culture that was going on behind the scenes that pushed Esther to the front of the line. People from that crowd, maybe Haggai, there's a reasonable chance that the reason the author of Esther keeps dropping that name is because there is some kind of irony there that maybe this Haggai fellow was one of the people who 20 years later, after the events described in Esther, did get tangled up in this assassination plot. What we know is that the back rooms and the group of eunuchs who served and advised the king, they became entangled with people who wanted Xerxes gone. And ultimately it was a eunuch and this other Artabanus who did kill Xerxes and ended his reign in that way. And so if Esther was written a few decades after the fact, then everybody would have that in mind as well as they read Esther chapter 2, that we're talking about eunuchs and court behind the scenes culture, and we're talking about two would-be assassins. All of this would be very evocative for the original audience because this would be like the Kennedy assassination, bigger than the Kennedy assassination if this were written after Xerxes was assassinated. Well, whatever the case, we know for sure that all this was recorded in the book of the annals in the presence of the king. And Herodotus, who you remember a few days ago, was like, "Goodbye, Herodotus. It's been really good. We will miss you," as though we were never going to read from him again. My bad on that. I shouldn't have done an emotional goodbye like that. Herodotus mentions this record that the king kept, King Xerxes kept, of his benefactors. And Herodotus tells us that some people who served the king in Greece on account of those deeds became despot of Samos, so they got rewarded with a place to rule over, appointed by the Persians. And, oh boy, Phylacos was recorded as a benefactor of the king and received much land as a reward. That's in Book 8 of the Histories, section 85. And of course, yesterday we talked about the story of Silason, the guy who gave Darius that cloak when Darius was a great big nobody. Then he showed back up at the king's gate in Susa later on and was like, "I'm a cloak guy, remember me?" And Darius was like, "Yeah, and you are mentally in my list of benefactors. I'm going to go sweep an island clean for you and let you be the ruler of that because thank you." So this is clearly a practice that the original audience would have been really clear on. These guys keep a record of the people who wronged them, and they keep a record of the people who were good to them, who served them, and they try to pay off both of those things in appropriate ways, meaning the original audience would know this list. It would be a huge deal that Mordecai is on this list. Esther participated in it, so mentally she's in even better stead in the mind of Xerxes. And now we just wait until the payoff comes. When will the king reward this benefactor who saved his life? Again, a passage like this makes it really clear that Esther is not meant to be understood as a fairy tale where the location and the setting don't matter. The way Esther is composed assumes that the original audience would be connecting a whole bunch of dots and be like, "Oh, I know that guy, I know that guy, I know that guy." And if recently you happen to put in 40 episodes worth of work to understand a little bit more about this era of Persian history, details like this also turn out to be a really nice payoff for you and me. So I think this is a blast. And I mean, the story, it's dangerous, it's high stakes, but it's shaping up in a promising way for good things to come out of this. I'm Matt. This is the 10-Minute Bible Hour podcast. Let's do this again soon.